I can say that firsthand, having been a first-person witness thereof last night. But Dr. Clemens is from Hagerstown, Maryland, where he taught for quite a while at the Hagerstown Community College there, ultimately retiring as Professor Emeritus, serving there. He graduated with his PhD from George Mason University.
34 years of undiscovered incompetence.
Harsh, another Civil War scholar for those of you that are familiar. He was a founder and serves as president of the Safe Historic Antietam Foundation. He's also a certified licensed guide at Antietam as well. He was the editor of the Ezra Carman manuscript, and of course Ezra Carman, essentially the first historian or early historian for the Antietam battlefield. So he is eminently qualified to speak on this topic this evening. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker and our winner of the Nevins-Freeman Award for this year, Dr. Thomas Clemens.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and even more of an honor to be honored with the award. So I'm truly humbled by all this. And always a pleasure to be in Chicago and to see you folks. One of the great highlights of my year so far, considering I haven't been anywhere or done anything. 2 days in a row in a shirt and a tie, you know. I'm confused. I'm used to running around in my sweats in the house most of the day. So, couple of things. First of all, I don't like people who read their PowerPoints to me, so I'm not going to read this to you unless you can't see it. But I figured you probably got this far in life by being able to read without my help. So, we're going to talk tonight. Let me see. You okay if I stand here?
Yes.
Okay. And does this remote now work?
Yeah, I hope so.
I hope so. We'll find out. So, Major General Joseph K.F. Mansfield, and of course the 12th Corps at Antietam. What do you know about General Joseph K.F. Mansfield?
Got killed early.
Got killed early. Yeah. Jonathan's not allowed to answer questions because he knows. He is someone who is more famous for his death than his life. That's all anybody knows about him is he died at Antietam. So I'm endeavoring tonight to correct that and tell you about him because I think he is greatly underestimated. For example, if you talk to a lot of people who have written or speak about Antietam, they'll come up with things like this about Mansfield. Whoops, well, it didn't work. All right. We can resolve that problem. Still didn't work.
Is the power thing on the remote there? On the left there, the orange thing?
Ah, turn it on. Boy, who would have thought? Okay, thank you. Let's try that now. Well, got a laser pointer. Yeah, but it doesn't seem to want to. I should be hitting an up or down arrow to make it.
Yeah, that's
Make it advance.
And it's not doing that either. Interesting enough. Foiled by technology once again. Well, most people will tell you about Mansfield that, and I put this in your newsletter directly, he was a desk soldier. Now, I was doing a tour of Antietam with Ed, which, of course, anybody who tours with Ed will tell you that you're the second banana on the card there. You get to listen a lot.
Yeah, sure.
So we stopped in the East Woods by the Mansfield Monument, and Ed, in his inimitable way, said, "Mansfield was a staffed puke." And went on, and when he came up for air, and I'm not normally this brave, but I stood up and I said, "Ed, I beg to respectfully disagree with you." I wrote a monograph about Mansfield, which was in a book called Corps Commanders in Blue, If you never heard of it, it's because it went to number 6 on the worst seller list. But so I gave him a very capsulated version of what I'm going to give you. And as I sat down, Ed said, "I will never refer to Mansfield as a staff puke again." Which I take as a moral victory. But that's the impression a lot of folks have. Too old for field service. You can see all these various things. I want to try to correct some of those misperceptions tonight because I think he's truly a remarkable person. Now, who is this? Well, it says right here, Major General Joseph K. Mansfield, Antietam, September 18th, 1864. This is the photograph that is in Francis Trevelyan Miller's Photographic History of the Civil War.
2 years gone.
But it's not Mansfield. How do I know that? Well, first of all, it doesn't look anything like him if you see the other pictures. You will in a moment. Secondly, for you uniform experts, when you see the buttons on a general's coat in groups of 3, what rank does that denote? Brigadiers wear their buttons in pairs. Field officers wear them evenly spaced. Major generals are by 3s. Mansfield was not promoted to Major General until several months after he was dead. So if he's wearing a Major General's coat, that's not Mansfield, is it? That or he looks a whole lot better after he's dead than I do alive. And if you really want to get down to the nitty-gritty, see that hat? It's the stiff, upright pom-pom hat that was discarded in 1858. So, here's what Mansfield really looks like, without a beard or with. Yeah. And notice that the coat that he's wearing there is a colonel's coat. The buttons are evenly spaced. In the picture with him as a beard. So I'm serious. I don't know who the other guy is. It's not Mansfield. But he doesn't look like any other major general I found a picture of, so I don't know. Here is another picture of Mansfield taken shortly before he came up to Antietam in the spring of 1862. And it's just not the same face. This, he is a brigadier general, and you can see the button spacing there, and he's holding the correct model 1858 hat. He even made it onto the money. A $500 bill. Yeah. Yeah. He is, I think, a very remarkable person in a lot of ways. Now, his father and mother divorced. His father was a sea captain and evidently had women in several ports. And so they divorced. He was the youngest son, and his older brother the oldest brother became his guardian. But the oldest brother was captured in the War of 1812 and died in a British prison. So Mansfield was sort of on his own at a very early age. But in part due to the respect for his older brother, he went to the military academy at West Point just shy of his 14th birthday. His uncle was a professor there, and of course the regard for his brother and the fact that several people wrote letters testifying to his intelligence, etc. So he not only went there, but second in his class. I think there's some other famous people that were second in their class, weren't they?
Robert E.
And nobody says George McClellan. Golly. Anyway. And posted to the engineers because that's where the top class goes. As a matter of fact, the class leader was a cousin of his, also from Connecticut. Yeah. So, George Dutton, who you've never heard of. It's okay. He was the principal engineer for building Fort Pulaski outside of Savannah. He was a couple of years into that job when a newly graduated engineer officer from West Point was sent to assist him, some guy named Robert E. Lee. And he had a lot of other, responsibilities, but more or less off and on, that's what he was doing up until the Mexican War. He also, of course, was getting married. His oldest son, Sam, is named, or is going to the military academy. His youngest son, Joseph, named after first cousin Joseph Totten, the chief engineer of the U.S. Army from 1838 to 1864. Yeah, nice to be connected, right? Your uncle's a professor, your first cousin's the engineer. But Mexican War happens. Now, we all know that Winfield Scott's campaign against Mexico City, his chief engineer was a fellow named Robert E. Lee, who was a captain in the engineers, came out of the Mexican War with 3 brevets and had been wounded. Taylor's army in the north, the chief engineer was?
Mansfield.
Thank you, Joseph Mansfield, who went in as a captain of engineers, came out with 3 brevets for his service there, and was severely wounded in the attack on Monterrey, leading troops, even though he was an engineer officer, supposedly just there to provide the direction about the terrain. So, a remarkable similarity between their careers, as you can see. However, 1853, when career Army officers are languishing in ranks for years and years and years, he has jumped directly from captain to colonel. Just like nobody I can think of. Yeah. Now, is this, again, family influence? One of the people that Mansfield impressed mightily at the Battle of Buena Vista was a colonel of a Mississippi regiment named Jefferson Davis, who was Secretary of War in 1853. Davis described Mansfield as one of the bravest men in the service. Yeah. So, again, maybe there's some family influence, but certainly, Davis thought highly of him. So what does the Inspector General of the Army do? He inspects the Army. And this is where I began to take some issue with Ed, because between 1853 and 1861, Mansfield inspected every U.S. military post in the continental 48 states. Every one. He left New Orleans and traveled across Texas by mule-drawn wagon and a small escort of cavalry in the 1853-54. Bandits, hostile Indians, Mexicans, you name it. And he had some very practical advice as well. He, for instance, was inspecting a garrison held by the dragoons, and he said, we're issuing these guys smoothbore musketoons, and if they try to carry them loaded on their sling, the ball falls out the end of the barrel. And that's a problem, yeah. And he said, why don't we issue our mounted troops one of these new breech-loading carbines like this guy named Sharps is making? But never fail, the Army won't do that until the Civil War starts, because these things cost money, right? Yeah, peacetime Army, we don't want to spend money. So he's making some very practical suggestions, but he inspects the Department of California. He went by boat to Panama, rode a mule across the neck of Panama, and then up the other side and inspected those ports. He later, in the 1850s, took expedition from St. Louis and went across the northern Rockies and inspected all the posts in Washington and Oregon coast. And, of course, if he's doing all this, he meets everybody. He knows practically every officer in the Army because he's inspecting all their posts. So, he's getting around. But my point is, this is hardly a desk job. He is traveling in some very difficult and dangerous territory. Borrowing the phrase "on the road again," he did the several of these inspections. He was in Texas up until January of 1861, literally on the eve of secession, but says nothing about it in his report. Interestingly, no mention at all. So, somebody with this kind of reputation and experience and well regarded by his peers would go on to have very important commands when the Civil War breaks out, right? It kind of looked like it at the start. He is put in charge of the Department of Washington, and not D.C., not Washington, Washington. Mansfield is the guy who looked up at that hill and said, we can't hold this city if those Custis folks still have that house up there. We've got to go up and take that away and put some cannon on that hill. He also was the fellow who designed the plan to capture Alexandria early in the war, where Elmer Ellsworth was killed, the first Union officer to be killed in the Civil War. The following year in 1862, my great-grandfather was named Joseph Ellsworth in Ellsworth's honor, which is why my son is Joseph Ellsworth. So keep it going, you know. But, I mean, he's doing all these things. And we always talk about the Barnard defenses around Washington. Well, who told Barnard to do it? Mansfield. We're going to build these forts around the city, fortify the capital. So he seems like he's on the rise. As a matter of fact, when time comes for the First Battle of Bull Run, there was discussion about who should lead these untrained volunteers out to push the Confederates out of Manassas Junction. Winfield Scott wanted Mansfield to do it, wanted Mansfield to have that command. But Salmon Chase of Ohio, gee, politics involved in the Army command, who would have thought, you know? Salmon Chase wanted McDowell, and McDowell wins out over the protests of Winfield Scott. And Mansfield was senior to McDowell. They were both promoted to brigadier general on, getting ahead of myself. When the war broke out in May of 61, they're both promoted to brigadier general, but before that happened, they were promoted on the same day. Mansfield ranked McDowell, and when you look at the listings, Mansfield's name is ahead of McDowell, so he was senior and should have gotten it. An army that was run by seniority, and he gets essentially overlooked because of politics. So, while McClellan is making his way in from Western Virginia to take command of the huddled masses around the capital, Mansfield is the guy who's organizing and putting everybody in position of defense, etc. He's a very capable guy. Now, McClellan, of course, much junior, but appointed not only commander of the Army of the Potomac, but in November of 61, commander of all Union armies in the field. He also was impressed with Mansfield. But Mansfield gets sent to Fort Monroe, the staging point for all the coastal operations on the Carolinas. And the person who was in charge of Fort Monroe, the general in command there, not yet. Wool, John Wool, one of 4 generals in the United States Army when the war broke out. He's senior to Mansfield, so Mansfield is subordinated to him. Wool uses Mansfield as a troubleshooter. He go down on the coast of Carolina and solidify what Burnside's doing and, you know, all that. Now, McClellan arrives, well, before we get to that, the famous Battle of the Ironclads, March of 62. Mansfield is commanding the troops from Fort Monroe, which are firing on the warships out in Hampton Roads. You may recall that when the Congress was attacked by the Virginia, that they lowered their flag. And under naval protocol, what does that mean? It means that the Confederate ship was essentially, that was a surrender, and that the Virginia steams in to take possession of this ship that had surrendered to them. And Mansfield's guys are on shore shooting at him. They probably wounded Frank Buchanan when he got up on top of the casemate of the Virginia. Now, Mansfield, one of his officers who evidently had been spending way too much time with the Articles of War in the back of the drill manual, went up to Mansfield and said, General, under the protocols of war, they're allowed to take possession of that ship. The ship surrendered. And Mansfield's response was, I know the damn ship surrendered. We haven't. Keep firing. So, yeah. One of the brigades under his command, and you'll hear about them later on, but they are sent up to be part of the Army of the Potomac just before the Battle of Antietam. And I'll try to remember to mention that later, but if I forget, you remind me. McClellan wanted Mansfield to be part of the Army of the Potomac. Unfortunately, Wool, now that McClellan has been removed from being commander of all Union armies in the field when he went to the peninsula, Wool ranks McClellan and says, nope, Mansfield's staying right here with me. Important to my operations. Good luck with taking Richmond. Yeah. And so Mansfield basically is still down at Fort Monroe and training troops and itching to get into a command and get into the fight, but his senior, Wool, doesn't want to let him go. Now, he does make it back to Washington in the aftermath of Second Manassas and the court-martials. And the way the Army works, if you're going to try a general officer by court-martial, the court has to be of generals of equal or senior rank, right? So Mansfield gets sent to Washington because they didn't have a whole lot of spare brigadier generals around, and he could be there on their court-martial. And none of the other generals named are probably standing out to you as, yeah. Anyway.
Except Colonel Holt.
Except who?
Except Colonel Holt.
Colonel Holt, yeah. I mean, not in combat, but he's an important guy. Now, while they're conducting these court-martials, of course, McClellan on September 3rd has been told to prepare an army to take the field. He was not told who was going to command that army. He asked, and they didn't tell him they'd made up their mind yet. But he gets picked by McClellan. On September 8th, orders are drafted for him to report to McClellan, and one of the brigades he trained down at Fort Monroe, Weber, because he's German, that's Max Weber, a 48er, is sent to French's division, well, what becomes French's division 2 days before the Battle of Antietam. So Weber's brigade at Sunken Road is trained by Mansfield, and although they'd never been in a battle, you recall, they performed pretty well there. For some reason, Mansfield does not get that September 8th order until the 12th of September. Or excuse me, I think it's the 11th. And he goes to several people in Washington. He goes to see Gideon Wells, another nutmegger from Connecticut, and basically says, I may never see you again this side of the dirt, but, and of course, as you can see, he doesn't think much of what Wool's been doing for him. Now, what Mansfield is going to be assigned to is what had been Nathaniel Banks's corps in the Valley. And you probably are very familiar with their record of combat. I was about to say successes, but not really. Obviously, the biggest thing is their fight at Cedar Mountain. Banks went into that fight, and you can see the numbers here. Basically, in Williams's division, every brigade commander was either killed or captured, and almost all of the regimental leaders were likewise killed, wounded, or captured. They took a real pounding. 81 officers, over 1,000 men out of 6,000. And worse than that, yes, you look at 12th Corps and you say, well, they didn't fight at Second Manassas, right? No, but they were marching back to Washington from Cedar Mountain from August 9th to the 30th or so with no provisions, no resupply, and no real medical attention. And so they lost more than this just marching back to Washington from guys falling out, guys being sick, etc. So this Corps is in rough shape. And of course, you know, here you go, Mansfield, you're now a Corps commander. But McClellan does take steps to augment this. Now, Alpheus Williams, probably the best mustache of the Civil War, I think.
Is that what that is? I wasn't sure.
Yeah, oh yeah, it's, you know, all waxed and out there.
Oh, my Lord.
He was the senior division commander in Banks's Corps. The other division commander, Augur, is elsewhere as well, and so George S. Greene takes command of the 2nd Division of the 12th Corps. And Mansfield finally catches up with the McClellan's army at Middletown, Maryland, on the 15th of September, the day after the Battle of South Mountain. Now, Banks stayed in Washington. He's technically in command of the defenses, and that means that Banks's staff stayed in Washington too. So Mansfield is arriving to take command of the 12th Corps, and he has appointed his son, Samuel Mather Mansfield, to be an aide-de-camp on his staff. Sam had graduated in June, and Joseph Mansfield sends him a message and says, "Fill your pockets with sandwiches and follow me." Practical, you know. Hey, army travels on the stomach. And if you eat hardtack, it'll bring you to your knees. But anyway. But other than his son, who doesn't get there until after his father is dead, he has one staff officer, a fellow named Clarence Dyer, and a Negro body servant. That's his staff. Beyond that, McClellan has realized that the 12th Corps is very short on men, and so he has put 5 brand new regiments into the 12th Corps to bring the numbers up. That's good news, but the numbers look like this. They take into combat at Antietam roughly 7,500 men. Of those 7,500 men, and these 5 new regiments comprising 4,500 men who have been in the Army less than 2 months. Over half of the Corps. And Williams hasn't commanded a division in battle before, neither has Greene. Williams's brigade has now been taken over by Samuel Crawford, and we'll get into him a little bit later. This is hardly the well-oiled, strong machine that a corps ought to be. So he's inheriting a lot of problems he did not create, but he's got to deal with it. He doesn't have a staff. He hasn't any experience in commanding a large number of troops like this before. And most of the troops that he's trying to command have no idea what they're doing yet. Not a formula for success. Now, you all know the Battle of Antietam well enough that on the night of the 16th, McClellan realizes he needs to confront the left flank of Lee's army, orders Hooker across the upper bridge with the 1st Corps. Hooker, being Hooker, starts complaining to McClellan as he says, "My corps is the only force on the same side of the creek with the whole rebel army, and in the morning they will gobble me up." And so McClellan sends Mansfield's 12th Corps. Why? He's got other corps available. 2nd Corps is there. 5th Corps is there with Sykes' division and Richardson's, Sykes and Morrell. Why does he send 12th Corps? I don't know. I can guess. If you notice, he's holding the 2 corps from his Army of the Potomac, 2nd and 5th, in the middle, and putting Burnside with his mixed corps to the left, and Hooker from Pope's army out to the right, and Banks again. So maybe McClellan wants to keep his trusted forces to hold the center of his line, because they didn't roll a dice and say, "You will receive, you will kick off," right? So McClellan has to think that, you know, what's Lee's reputation up to this point? He's aggressive, he attacks. So you have to think about that. Maybe that's why, I don't know. But he probably could not have sent a more ill-prepared, inexperienced corps than the 12th Corps. Now they bivouac on the farm of George Line, L-I-N-E, which invariably veterans of the battle spell L-I-O-N, but you know, the name was not on the mailbox. So, and as you know, of course, Hooker's Corps kicks off the battle at dawn on the 17th of September, advancing southward, and Mansfield's Corps is camped about a mile north of there, around the Line Farm. Williams in his diary writes that he got very little sleep because Mansfield kept all night long telling him things to do and asking him stuff. So he, you know, came across to Williams as very nervous and, you know, fidgety, which I guess, given the circumstances, isn't surprising. McClellan did realize that trying to command 7,500 men with a general and a staff officer wasn't a good situation, so he loans another staff officer to Mansfield. So now you've got 3 people to control 2 divisions with 7,500 men. You'll see a lot of letters after the battle that talk about Mansfield as riding around shouting orders like a crazy man. Well, no kidding. You know, because he's trying to do everything himself. He does, while his corps is still getting up, move forward to a gap essentially between the east and north woods. People think that Mansfield had no idea, no communication with Hooker. He did. He rode forward and watched Hooker's corps going in, and somewhere around 7 o'clock, as his corps is coming onto the north end of the battlefield, basically around the top of the east woods and the gap that Mansfield had been sitting in, Hooker says, First Corps is getting low on ammunition. They've taken a lot of casualties. Stretch your leading division from the east woods all the way across the field to the other side of the Hagerstown Pike. First Corps is going to fall back through you, and then you will continue the advance. So Mansfield starts riding back to place his troops to fulfill what Hooker told him to do. The slow and tedious part, and Mansfield's riding up and down the line of the soldiers, and he kept saying, "Have you guys had any breakfast?" And the answer was no. "Stop and eat some breakfast right now." But the soldiers complained that by the time they got fires going to cook their coffee, they were ordered to march again. So they never really did get their breakfast. These are some of Ezra Carman's map, and they're probably way too small for you folks to see, but here is the Miller cornfield. This is the east woods here, north woods there, west woods. This is First Corps fighting, and here you can see essentially Lawton's division. This is early on. Here is 12th Corps marching toward the battlefield with Williams's division in the lead and Greene following. And notice that they are marching in a formation that is compact. Mansfield has, like a lot of these regular officers, very little confidence that these volunteers can march and deploy into the line of battle properly, particularly in a woods, and more so if they're under fire. So he's holding them in a formation which is, and if you haven't studied the drill manual, I'll explain this, but close column of division. If you took a regiment of 10 companies, the 2 in the middle on either side of the colors would be your first division, 2 companies forward, and then all the other 8 companies line up behind them. So it's basically a column of 5 lines made of 2 companies of men each, and almost like 3 feet from one line to the next. It is a good compact formation for marching, particularly through the fields and open ground. Not so great for going into battle, because only that front division of 2 companies can actually fire. But Mansfield doesn't want these new regiments to deploy until they get, out of the woods. And so here you can see between 6:45 and 7, First Corps is still here. Mansfield is coming down into this opening between north and east woods, and one of his leading regiments, the 128th Pennsylvania, led by Colonel Crosdale, goes across a little mound of bare ground in the upper part of the East Woods. And in this column by division formation, they get a volley from Confederates. Crowsdale is killed. His major, there's no lieutenant colonel there, the major is severely wounded. And of course, the 128th Pennsylvania start to scatter. In fact, one veteran remembered hearing Mansfield ride up to Williams and shouting at the top of his lungs, "Bring up your old troops and take back these Pennsylvania cattle." Well, I can see what he's getting at, but could have been handled more delicately. Now, as this develops in a little bit more scale here, and again, this is East Woods, this is North Woods, and this is Hood's counterattack. Just as Mansfield rides back to bring his corps forward is when Hood's division counterattacks and pushes basically the First Corps back. And so the 20 to 25 minutes that Mansfield's gone, a lot happened that he does not know. So as they're getting to this position, one of his leading regiments, a veteran regiment, the 10th Maine Infantry, comes into the East Woods, and essentially the Smoketown Road is here, and this was a fence line. And the 10th Maine is going to be the anchor on the right, and the rest of the Corps is supposed to deploy out this way across the fields. As the 10th Maine arrive there, against Mansfield's order, they deploy into line of battle, and they start shooting because there are Confederates in front of them. But Mansfield, riding from over to the west, comes in front of the 10th Maine, waving his arms and shouting, "Cease firing, you're shooting into your own men," because he thinks First Corps is still out there. Now, the 10th Maine are veterans, and a couple of them call back and say, "No, you're mistaken, those are Confederates." Mansfield sees them and starts to move his horse through the 10th Maine to dismount and let them open fire when a bullet passes through his right lung, front to back. One of the 10th Maine said that the horse started to falter. Mansfield dismounted, led him across the rails, and that a breeze kind of blew open the coat that Mansfield was wearing, and he could see that Mansfield's vest was soaked with blood. And he was quickly placed in a blanket and carried back up the Smoketown Road to the line farm up there. So he had been in battle perhaps half an hour. Pardon? How old was he? He was a couple of months shy of his 59th birthday. Well, now.
For then, older.
Yeah. I got neckties almost that old. Yeah, for a commander, he is old. Now, he's not the oldest commander on the field. Who is? Sumner. Sumner's 65, and that gives me hope. But yeah, so almost immediately, he is knocked out of the fight. And for the rest of the day, Williams assumes command of the Corps, but basically he spends most of his time with the two brigades of his original division, Gordon and Crawford. And Greene takes two of his three brigades and pushes down to occupy the hill where the visitor center is located. And the 3rd Brigade of Greene's division gets sent over to fight along the Hagerstown Pike here. So basically, these two divisions for the rest of the day kind of fight on their own hook. Now, yeah, here's 7:30. There is the cornfield. Here is the 10th Maine along this fence line. This fence line now, this is the Smoketown Road, and this fence line is now the Mansfield Road, which leads down to the Poffenberger Farm and the Michael Miller Farm, not to be confused with the David Miller Farm, anyway. And one of the officers in the 10th Maine was a fellow named John M. Gould. Gould spends the next 30-some years arguing that Mansfield was wounded in front of the 10th Maine. Why does he do that? Because the 125th Pennsylvania, which is back here at this point, in their after-action report of the battle, the colonel says, General Mansfield was wounded in front of my command and 4 of my men carried him off the field. And Gould goes apoplectic and says, oh, no, 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 no. It isn't in our after-action report, but in the history of our regiment written in 1871, we say he was killed in front of us. And so Gould starts writing to everybody he can think of in his regiment and in Crawford's entire division and says, what do you remember? Because and the veterans, and I love this, the veterans groups come down, the 125th comes down, puts up a sign on one of the trees, Mansfield wounded right here. Gould puts up a sign and says, no, he's wounded right here. And this goes on for years. There are literally hundreds of letters from veterans to Gould about this whole topic. I mean, and it seems kind of a minor thing to us, but to soldiers, this is really important. And so the other thing that Gould wanted to know is, who shot Mansfield? What Confederate outfit? And so he starts writing to all these Confederates. What are your memoirs? Where were you? And all that. And I mean, the good side of this is it gives us a very rich trove of interesting letters of guys remembering Antietam. But this is basically what Gould's trying to figure out. Now, if you know the battle, the remnants of the troops who had been there earlier are still here. This is the 21st Georgia, which had been part of Lawton's division, Trimble's brigade. This is the 4th Alabama, which is Wofford's brigade with Hood, who came up later, and also the 5th Texas. So you've got 3 regiments from 3 different brigades, 2 different divisions, but they become this sort of rock in the stream as the 12th Corps starting to come down this way. They're the resistance. And then, of course, D.H. Hill will send up 3 of his brigades to fight. So one of them is Roswell Ripley. Anybody ever heard of Roswell Ripley? Yeah. D.H. Hill and a couple of colonels from North Carolina start writing letters in the 1880s, and they call Roswell Ripley everything but a nice guy. D.H. Hill says that if he'd known he was a coward, he would never have put him in command of a brigade. Seriously. And guys in the brigade went to Ripley that morning and said, you know, you've never really led us in battle. We'd really like to see you out front leading us. He does, gets a minor wound in the neck in the first 20 minutes and goes to the rear. So, at any rate. So it might have been them who shot Mansfield, but also there is this mysterious skirmish battalion of Colquitt's Georgia Brigade, where they had selected a company from each of the 5 regiments to be the permanent skirmish line, and they were operating independently. And so, again, Gould is writing to everybody he can think of, and, you know, these Georgians, were you in the East Woods? Do you remember? So it goes on and on and on. Very important to him. Now, as far as Mansfield's concerned, basically, he is taken up the road back to the line farm. They make a bed for him there. The surgeon of the Corps comes to see him and basically says the wound is fatal and he cannot live. He was awake. They gave him some spirits, but he kind of choked on them. He did ask for water several times. While he's laying there wounded, someone comes and tells him that both Hooker and Burnside have been killed. They're wrong, of course, but Mansfield utters, too bad, poor fellows, because he knew them. You know, they've been Army officers. And so he will expire somewhere about 8 o'clock, between 8 and 10 minutes after 8, the next morning on the 18th. His son arrives that afternoon. Before he died, Mansfield asked that his body be taken back to Connecticut to his family. That was done, and there was a large memorial service. There's a printed book about all the speeches everybody gave that day. He was from Middletown, Connecticut. And interestingly enough, the Middletown, Connecticut Historical Society is in Mansfield's house. Yeah. So.
Buried there.
Buried there, yes. Mm-hmm. And so, as I say, the 12th Corps divides. Here you can see Gordon's brigade. But notice the 124th Pennsylvania is over here. That's from Crawford's brigade and one of the new regiments. 10th Maine still over here. Others of the 12th Corps go forward and fight in this area, but it's completely disjointed. As I say, Williams is senior. And the other controversy that springs from this is when McClellan writes his after-action reports. Yes, he wrote 2. He wrote one in October of 1862 when he was still in command of the Army. He wrote one in April of 63 after he'd been removed. They're very different, as you can imagine. But responding to the first one, Alpheus Williams in April of 1863 writes a letter to McClellan saying, your October report barely mentions the 12th Corps at all, and the only general you mention is Crawford. And this really burns Williams' behind. He's very upset about this because he says, you know, we've done all this great stuff and you don't give us any credit. Well, you know, part of it is that there were not that many after-action reports. And, you know, it's Banks's Corps. McClellan doesn't really know them that well. But in the end of it, Williams says, in the beginning of the battle, he said, Crawford rode up to me and asked me what to do, and I told him to deploy his brigade because I knew he couldn't do it. Now, you remember that Sam Crawford was at Fort Sumter when it was bombarded, right? But what was his job? What was he doing? He was a doctor. Yeah, he's a medical officer. He's not a combat guy. And Williams sent a copy of that letter to Ezra Carman, and in Ezra Carman's handwriting at the bottom of it, he puts a note and he says, the only time, he said, Crawford had it reported in the Philadelphia papers that he was wounded rallying my regiment. He said, the only time I saw Crawford all day long, he was behind a ledge of rocks, safely ensconced where nothing could touch him. So, and if you read Crawford's report, it's pretty vague. So, at any rate, there's that controversy as well. So, what do you think? Desk soldier, incompetent in command, doesn't know what's going on with Hooker? I think he was a very capable person, somebody who might have had quite a career as a Corps commander or an Army commander, but we'll never know because it gets snuffed out too early. But with that, and as I say, 2 staff officers, 2 division commanders, maybe 1 division commander because Crawford seems to be hiding. With that, I will take your questions. If you have any. Yes, sir.
What about Green? Would I attempt to study
Well,
a real confusing battle in that part of the field?
well, let me get my other lecture about Green here.
Green's brigade is out there
Yes,
for a long time.
he's a division commander. He's got 2 brigades. Yeah,
Out there.
Yeah.
At least one of the brigades is out there, I think. And he's pretty close to the Dunkirk Church. Is the lay of the land there such? I'm trying to mind myself, the lay of the land. Was it such that maybe the rest of his people didn't see him there, or was it command confusion that did not allow him to be seen? Because it seems to me that he was out there in a pretty good spot, but was not supported.
You bring up a very good topic. And yeah, Green had 3 brigades. His division was much smaller. His 3 brigades probably totaled no more than about 2,500 men. And one of them had been detached to go over and fight by the David R. Miller farm. So he's got 2 brigades, basically Stainrook and Tyndall. And there's a lot of veteran troops in there, but they were, again, badly shot up at Cedar Mountain. He has the new, or relatively new, 28th Pennsylvania. They were unscathed at Cedar Mountain. They were elsewhere. They have 15 companies in the regiment at Antietam. Yeah, Joseph Gary was Gary was their original commander. He's not at Antietam. But at any rate, their commander was R.A.O. Pardee at Antietam, who Pardee Field at Gettysburg is named for, yeah. What Green did was he came down the Smoketown Road, and when you get to about where the lane goes down to the Moomaw Farm, if you notice, there's a ridge that kind of runs diagonally southwestward that the visitor center is sitting on.
Right.
And this is why nobody at Antietam talks about Green, because most of his fighting is where the visitor center sits. And they'd kind of embarrass them to say that, the 7th Ohio was right here in the desk, and the downstairs was where the 66th Ohio. Yeah, literally, it's right there. What he did was the Confederate Army artillery has vacated that high ground and pulled back to the real farm ridge. He goes up to that ridge, but what he's doing is he's on the back side of the ridge, the defilade, as the military would say, because anytime they stand up on the ridge, they're getting hammered from Confederates in the West Woods. And so he's basically trading shots there. They run low on ammunition, but they are moving back and forth. And after Sedgwick's repulse from the West Woods, Greene sends Steinruck's division, or Steinruck's brigade, and part of another brigade into the West Woods. They move past the Dunkard Church and occupy the high ground in the West Woods from about 11 o'clock in the morning till 1 o'clock in the afternoon. You don't hear about that fight either, do you? But he did a lot of fighting there. But as I say, he's mostly on his own hook. He's not, responding to any orders from Williams or anybody else. It's just, he knows the Confederates are there, and he basically sends this foray across the field into the West Woods after Second Corps, Sedgwick's division's been repulsed from there. So and he runs low on ammunition. At one point, he's out of ammunition entirely and just kind of on the back side of the hill waiting. You may recall when Sedgwick comes up with Sumner, the Corps commander, Sumner can see Greene's division on the backside of that ridge where the visitor center is. And so he realizes that there's Union troops there. And he just pushes up onto their flank. But a good question, a lengthy and I'm sorry, much too long answer. But
because I always, again, this is a very complex part of the battle, probably one of the most complex, other than the wheat field, I would say, at Gettysburg. But one sees Greene there, and he's not moving a whole lot during that entire back and forth.
Right.
So many units over such a rather lengthy period of time.
Yeah.
I just wondered what was going on with Greene.
Yeah.
And why he wasn't reinforced, because it looked to me like Greene could have made some headway.
A want of leadership. Had there been a Corps commander who recognized what Greene was doing, he could have gotten reinforcements. But
Which then leads one to ask about Sumner, but I think that might be another question.
that's another topic too. These people's, yes, sir.
What were the casualty figures of the 12th Corps in Antietam? Are they indicative of anything in particular?
They did a lot of fighting. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head. Believe it or not, there's parts of Carmen's manuscript I have not yet memorized. But but the 12th Corps, as I say, went in with 7,500 men. I believe their losses were somewhere in the vicinity of 2,000, but that's a guess. They lost a pretty good amount of men. And that's part of what Williams is mad about is, hey, we did all this fighting, we lost all these guys, you could at least mention us.
Just a quick question about his son. What happened to his military career?
He stays in the military for some time.
Is he still in the 12th Corps?
No. He was only his father's aide, and so he, and he's regular Army. He hasn't taken a volunteer commission, so they send him elsewhere. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What, if anything, was the exact command relationship between Hooker and Mansfield? Did McClellan say, Mansfield, you're subordinate to Hooker, or you should, sort of cooperate and obey whatever he wants?
Almost, yes. When Hooker's complaining, Mansfield, the language that McClellan uses is, I will send Mansfield to your support. So he's clearly designating Hooker what we would call today the operational commander, and Mansfield is subordinate to Hooker. Now, there isn't a paper trail of that, but, in terms of battlefield command, that's what McClellan told Hooker, and that's the way Hooker operates. Hooker has been criticized for not bringing Mansfield forward sooner, which is another whole can of worms we could get into, but I think there's some arguments on both sides of that one that are valid. So, but Hooker is clearly the operational commander, and of course, as you remember, he's wounded about 8:45. So when Sumner arrives, he finds himself the senior commander on that end of the line with no idea what happened before he got there or where anybody else is. So
Is it correct or not that Hooker had the only corps across the creek before morning?
Well, Mansfield's corps crosses at night. They go into bivouac some of them on the Line Farm, the tail end of the column bivouacs on the Hoffman Farm, and some of them are in bivouac by midnight, some of them not until 3 in the morning
Of the 17th.
of Mansfield's Corps. Yeah, on the 16th, on the night of the 16th, the morning of the 17th, yeah.
Sumner didn't cross until the next day, so.
No, but he sent his artillery across in anticipation, even though he was ordered not to. Yeah.
But no discussions between Mansfield and Hooker on
I-
the 16th.
None that I can document. I wouldn't want to say it didn't happen, but I can't document any discussions. And McClellan does stick around on the afternoon of the 16th. He actually is taking part in the firefight in the Poffenberger Woods north of the East Woods on the late afternoon of the 16th. He actually goes over to an artillery battery and is directing them about fire against the Confederate battery in the vicinity of West Woods on the afternoon or evening of the 16th.
Where was Mansfield taken upon his wounding, and where did he die? In a house?
He died in the Line House.
In the Line House.
Yeah, he was taken up to the Line House where they had camped the night before. And they found there was a room that still had a bed, even though there were a lot of wounded in the house. And all sorts of people came to see him, the medical director and lots of others. It was very tragic. And as I say, he was pretty much lucid till near the end, and asked several times about the progress of the battle. Yes, sir.
Mansfield, Ohio name for him.
You know, I asked Mary that question tonight since she's from Mansfield, Ohio.
I don't think so.
She doesn't think so.
I don't think so.
But it's a good question. I wondered it myself.
Can you comment just briefly on the epicenter track for them?
Can I comment? Yeah.
Just briefly.
Switching hats here for a moment, let's talk about preservation. The last 5-6 years we have been very good at Antietam. And if you haven't been there in that amount of time, you're going to see a very different battlefield. The 44-acre triangle that's in south of the cornfield and north of the Dunkard Church, and the triangle is kind of Hagerstown Pike, the Tor Road through the cornfield area, and the Smoketown Road. That 44 acres was purchased by American Battlefield Trust for close to $500,000. Our organization put, I think, 25 into that purchase. We also tore down the brick house that was up in the North Woods on the west side of the Hagerstown Pike right before you go up the hill. There was a little 2-story, 3-bedroom brick house and garage. And that was purchased by the trust at auction in September of 2016, 15, 16. And again, we put some money into that. We also bought that ugly house that was in the East Woods forever, that little white house there. That was turned over. Local lady owned that and rented it out. And she had a young lady who wasn't blood kin, but she's regarded almost as a granddaughter. It was that close. And so she got married, so she let her and her husband buy that place. He went to the county and said, went to the Park Service and said, now I know you have an easement on these 5 acres, but it doesn't include farm buildings, and I'm going to put a couple cows in here, and I got to put up a barn. So he built a barn with a cement floor that thick with all kinds of rebar in it, and then put up a huge metal garage, and the next thing you know, he is working on diesel engines in there, on dump trucks and school buses and everything else. The Park Service went to him and said, looks like you're running a business here. And he said, oh, no, I'm just doing this for my friends. I don't take any money. Yeah. But karma can be, you know what. And he got in some trouble with his wife, and basically they got a divorce. And so he went to the Park Service and said, do you want to buy this? And they said, no, but let us give you American Battlefield Trust phone number. And so they bought it, and we again put some money into that purchase. And so that and the house barn and all the stuff that was out in the epicenter, we tore down. We paid for that and brought in a demo guy. We cut most of the wood line out with volunteer help from Schaff. So basically 3 different properties, 3 different non-historic houses, and 3 different non-historic barns torn down, somewhere north of $2 million, all told. Yeah. Now, this summer, and again, I'm kind of, I didn't have put together a PowerPoint on this, but you've probably been through the driving tour road at Antietam. You go down at the lower end of the field, you go down to Burnside Bridge, you come back up and there's a stop about halfway up the hill with a couple of cannons and all that. And your next tour stop is going all the way down Branch Avenue, up to Harpers Ferry Road, Harpers Ferry in town, and then out the Shepherdstown Boonesboro Pike to the National Cemetery. So top of the hill there, or halfway up the hill, is tour stop 10. Tour stop 11 is the National Cemetery. Where do you stop to see and interpret A.P. Hill's arrival, his flanking of the Ninth Corps, and the whole climactic ending of the Battle of Antietam? There isn't any place. No place to pull your car over and get out and look at that, to say nothing of a motor coach. Well, this summer, when you come out of that tour road and turn back towards town, almost immediately on your left, there's a couple of structures that sit up on high ground above the road. One of them came up for sale, and we bought it. Chaff. Long story, but basically there were some problems with it. We gave him a lowball offer, and they took it. And that's always a good thing. Next to it is a house trailer that the roof blew off of about 3 years ago, owned by a very eccentric lady who has a very interesting idea of the value of vacant lots with abandoned house trailers on them. But she was a cousin of the guy we bought the house from, and when she saw that we were paying cash and serious, she came down quite a bit in price, and so we bought that about 2 months after we bought the house. So we now own 2 lots side by side, about 1 acre. We have 2 different driveways onto Harpers Ferry Road, and so our long-term plan is we're going to demolish the houses, put in a parking area there that can accommodate up to a motor coach, and some interpretive tablets to get that view of that field that you can't get now. Ultimately, we'd like to give this to the National Park Service, but that's going to be a boundary expansion. So, well, minor boundary adjustments can be done. This is pretty minor, an acre that's adjacent to the park boundary, but it's still long and torturous, okay? But that's our plan.
So what you're saying is that the park boundary does not include the property up to the Harpers Ferry Road?
It does up to the Harpers Ferry Road, but the property we bought is west of the road.
Oh, it's on the other side of the road.
Yeah, and because that's where the park boundary ends, the logical assumption from everybody is that's where the battle ended. That they stopped at the road. They didn't. But, when they're assessing what is vital for the national government to own, this was seen as not that important.
I can recall from my first visits to the battlefield that the cornfield was a cornfield.
Yeah.
Couldn't trot onto it, nor could you trot into any part of the south end of the battlefield inside the Harpers Ferry Road or just north of where the monument was there to, I forget the president. But,
McKinley, yeah.
I'm sorry, McKinley.
Yeah, yeah.
So now, with
Coffee
all
Boy
those
Joe.
trails there,
Coffee.
I forgot which president was.
Yeah.
But now, of course, when we were there, we were there last in 2015.
Well, let me give you
You can walk those trails now.
Yes. When the War Department turned Antietam Battlefield over to the National Park Service in 1933, the government owned 60 acres at Antietam. 60 acres. And that included the National Cemetery. Okay? And it kind of stayed that way for a long time. This was a plan that basically, and for quite some time, Gettysburg and Antietam were jointly administered. And of course, who's the red-haired stepchild of that relationship. But so it stayed that way for quite a while. And the idea was, well, this is a rural farming town. There's no real development pressure. Nothing's going to happen here. So we just buy right-of-ways through the fields because the fields will still be fields and everybody will see the battlefield and be fine. That's why all the monuments are along those narrow avenues, because that's all the government owned. And it gradually increased over the years, but the real big jump came about 1995 when John Howard became superintendent. And under his 15-year administration, 60% of the land inside the authorized boundary either came into National Park Service ownership or a very tight easement. So we now, in the 3,200 acres, that's the entire boundary, we own or control almost everything in there. And in 1991, because of all the fuss that Schaff and other organizations were kicking up, the state of Maryland came out and creatively using federal highway money, they bought development rights on 4,800 acres around the 3,200 that's the battlefield, so that we now have a preserved 8,000 acre Civil War site.
Is it the
Biggest,
is it the overlay?
yeah. Well, the overlay is a zoning. This was buying easements. We were knocking on people's doors saying, hey, how much money do you want to never develop your farm? And so this is the biggest Civil War preserve in the country, 8,000 acres that will always be farmland.
Is that how the real farm came into that, or is that different? Or what are the plans for the real farm? Because I consider that to be a pretty important part of the battle in terms of interpretation, which as of now, there's nothing.
I agree with you. In fact, we've had our last 2 work days for Schaff clearing some of the trees along the bottom of the real farm ridge, so we can at least stand on the battlefield and point to the real farm and say that ridge was full of Confederate artillery. And if you want to know what stopped the Union soldiers once they took Sunken Road from moving forward, look at that ridge. A couple years ago, I took Will Green up there. You know Will. You know his opinion of McClellan. And I took him around the battlefield and I walked him up on Real Ridge and I said, September 18th, Lee's army's on this ridge. Real pushover to just drive right through him, huh? And he kind of said, well, he said, I've always given McClellan an F and you've got him up to a C-. Yes, he did.
Well, I know also that Dennis told me one time to go into the city cemetery across from the National Cemetery and walk out side of it. That ridge is kind of an extension of the ridge that leads to Nicodemus.
Yes.
And from there, you can visualize the whole line of artillery line from there, from
Yeah.
the
Oh, yeah.
cemeteries to the real farm up to Nicodemus. And I was there during foliage time, but in the fall or the winter, you would be able to see that entire ridge and understand the battle so much better. That's why I walked up onto the real farm. I think this was before anybody owned it. I just walked up there anyway to get a feel for what that was like.
I agree with you completely. I think it's very important terrain. It's clearly part of the battlefield. It ought to be in the national boundary. It's not. Again, it's going to be a big, something that big is probably going to take an act of Congress. The other thing, too, is because a park boundary expands, the park's budget to maintain those fields does not necessarily expand. So if they take it in, you know, they've got a big financial problem. So right now it's owned by the American Battlefield Trust. They've owned it for, more years than I remember offhand. It is leased out. There is one Mennonite family that lives in the house. There's another Mennonite family, that's his cousin, that's farming it. The Dillers, yeah. David and Daniel Diller, something like that, yeah.
Just in case anybody's wondering, there, Dennis is Dennis Fry, so.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Cool.
You've been there before, but don't know, when you're driving up to the, when you're driving out of the town, the small town of Sharpsburg, you're driving up to the visitor center, the real farm is on your left.
That whole ridge on your left. And all those houses along the road that were put in about the 1960s, and that's being considered as well.
Bit by bit.
Bit by bit. So, yeah, this is getting longer than you all want to sit down. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, this is fascinating.
No, let's do another.
Thanks for doing
Thank
that.
you.
The preservation part's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Once